Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I'm joined by Shay Rabineau, who is Associate Professor of Israel Studies and the Chair of the Department of Judaic Studies at Binghamton University. He is also the author of Walking the Land, A History of Israeli Hiking Trails. Thanks so much for being here today, Shay. It's really nice to see you and to think about walking in Israel and the role of trails and the land in the history of Israel, but also in modern socio-political frameworks as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
I thought we would start by you showing us a map that you brought with you or brought to the computer. We're not actually physically in the same space. And I'm looking forward to hearing about why this map is important to you.
Okay, so yeah, my artifact here is kind of big, so I'm going to try to hold it in a way that everybody can see. This is a map of, some people might recognize, this is the southern end of the Dead Sea. And this is a map in Hebrew, released in the 1960s, of Israel's first trail network. It was the first mapped and marked trail network in pretty much the whole of the Middle East. I'll hold up the map so you can see the trails themselves. It's a 1 to 100,000 scale map that's modified. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the Israelis took the old British Survey of Palestine maps that they had made in the 30s and 40s. This is a modification of one of those at a 1 to 100,000 scale. And this marks kind of the transition from maps being military documents in Israel to becoming civilian documents that people began to use to actually hike through the country. This was kind of a big milestone because it was the first map available to civilians who wanted to just go walk around and explore the country. And to get one of these maps, an Israeli actually had to show their national ID card and give their number so that if these ever fell into the hands of terrorists or whatever, not that I don't think they ever did, they would be able to trace kind of the origin. The person who owned this map, I found it in a Tel Aviv bookshop about 10 years ago. And I got really lucky to find it because there aren't a whole lot of these drifting around anymore. But this is the cover of the map. It says, map of the marking of trails in the Judean desert. And it even has the name of the guy on there, Reuven Bet from Mishmar HaEmek, which is a kibbutz up in northern Israel. So to me, this is a nice little artifact that might be a good way to lead into some of the stories that we'll be able to tell today about modern hiking and walking and trekking in Israel.
Have you ever tracked down the owner of the map? It would be so interesting to find out who he was.
It would be, yeah. No, I've never tracked it down. I mean, it's just written in ballpoint pen up there. Presumably, I imagine he wrote it on there in the 60s. But yeah, Mishmar HaEmek is a small enough kibbutz I could probably trace it back to the family.
Yeah. Were the trails on the map the black lines? I should have asked you why you were holding it up.
Yeah, now it's folded up, but it was kind of hard to see because of the way this room is backlit. But yeah, there are lines in black, green, red, and blue, I think. And those are the four colors that Israel's trails are marked with, right? So when they actually paint blazes on the ground, they use two white stripes with another color in between. So the colors on the map correspond with the colors of the blazes that you'll encounter in the field.
I can't think of probably another piece of geography on the face of the earth that has such an interesting heritage, history, cultural, political, religious meanings as what you have just shown us. So I'm looking forward to digging into that a bit more. How did you get interested in the study of Israeli trails?
It's a great question. I do always feel like I have to preface what I do by kind of explaining that, right? Because it's a weird topic. I'm neither Jewish nor Israeli. I grew up in the American Midwest. And my first interest in the so-called Holy Land was, the Holy Book. I mean, I grew up reading the Bible. My dad's a minister in, the small town where I grew up in Indiana. And I was always interested in that part of the world, kind of in that abstract sense, growing up in church and kind of reading about these places. But then when I was older, I studied Arabic. I was studying the Middle East in college. I had the opportunity to go to Jerusalem, and I just became fascinated with the place. I started studying Hebrew concurrent with my Arabic when I came back. And then later on, I had an opportunity to get a job working for a tour operator based out of the United States who was bringing mostly Christian tour groups over to Jerusalem. And so that gave me some kind of, I don't know, time on the ground, getting to explore. And after a lot of doing that, I became interested in other ways of exploring the country. I found out that they had these hiking trails. And, growing up in the Boy Scouts and, kind of doing things on the ground, learning about places through walking and exploring, like being a kid on your bike, like riding around town. That was kind of the way I always learned anyway. So in 2006, my best friend growing up and my brother agreed to go with me to go and hike this long distance trail across Israel that summer. So we spent 1 month just kind of bumming our way on Israel's so-called national trail. And it was an amazing experience. It wasn't the tourist type of experience that, I don't know, you might get if you go hiking in Europe or something like that. We found that it was only Israelis on the trail. And when we encountered them, they always thought it was so weird that Americans wanted to come and hike in their country. And we thought it was weird that they thought that was weird, right? I mean, millions of tourists go to Israel every year. Many of them are going to walk in the footsteps of, you name it, right? Some religious figure or something like that. So we thought it was strange that they didn't understand our reasons for walking through the country. And we're saying, well, there's scenery, there's ruins, there's archaeology, there's religious histories, any number of things. But we discovered that I think Israelis tend to regard the act of walking the land as a very Israeli thing to do. And so that just raised all kinds of questions for me. Why do I feel as a hiker like I'm intruding somehow on their private experience with their country? It's not that we were made to feel unwelcome. It was more that we could just tell that we were doing something that they really thought of as a special thing that Israelis do with what they see as the Jewish homeland. And that just raised all the questions. When I was in my PhD program later in Israel studies at Brandeis, I just couldn't stop thinking about these trails. And finally, I went to my advisors and said, it seems like it might be a weird thing for someone being trained as a historian to want to write about hiking trails, but I really think I'm onto something here. And in the end, my dissertation and eventually my book became an exploration of Israel's history through the growth of this trail network. So that was kind of how it all started, and I'm still exploring it.
When you went to hike the national trail with your brother, did you envision yourself on some type of spiritual quest or a pilgrimage, or was this sort of like a grand tour but happening within the Israeli context?
It was really both, I think. I had done the standard pilgrimage-y things already. I'd traveled by bus and I'd stayed in hotels and I'd been to all the sites, right? And the sites of different sects. I mean, I'd spent time at the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, kind of down around the historic Temple Mount. I had, of course, been to, right, what the Temple Mount is now is the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, third holiest site to Muslims. And I'd explored, Christian sites across the Galilee, Catholic and Protestant venerated areas. So those, of course, resonated with me personally in my faith. So going to Israel to try to walk across it was a kind of pilgrimage for me, especially when I made it up to the north. So there was a long section of trail that we were able to do in an unbroken line from the Mediterranean Sea all the way up to the Sea of Galilee, to the very foot of the Golan Heights on the northern border of the country. And this is the place where Jesus grew up and spent his time. And I remember getting tired of walking in my boots because it was May, June, and it was getting really hot. And so I ditched the boots and I wore sandals. And I remember walking through the Galilee, getting my feet torn up with thorns and thinking, Jesus in the Gospels talks about thorns, and he seems to hate them. And I really thought, wow, this is kind of what it was like. I mean, I'm in a modern country. I'm wearing modern sandals. I'm carrying a backpack. This is not what I'm reading about in the Gospels. But I did feel a sense of connection with the people I had read about in the Bible. And it made all of that feel a bit more real to me. But on the other side, it was a hike. It was a trek. you couldn't escape the modern dimensions of things, all the way from just modern technology, having a cell phone in your pocket, being able to buy things at a gas station, crossing highways and roads, but then also the outbreak of modern warfare, right? The 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, called the Second Lebanon War at the time, broke out right as we were finishing that hike, right on the northern border. So that all came roaring in. And so modern political events also broke in a way that I think sort of shattered the framework for making that feel like a religious pilgrimage.
Were there elements of your faith that were challenged or changed as a result of this particular pilgrimage?
Um, well, I don't know that my faith was changed exactly, but I do think that the sustained experience of being in the places that I had read about in the Bible and now having these deep associations with them. It's one thing, for me at least, to travel on a bus, to see these kinds of places, but it's a different thing if you spent 1 hour crossing the Galilee in a bus, seeing things blast past the bus windows while the air conditioning is on and the tour guide is talking on a microphone. That's one thing. But it's a whole other thing for that 1 hour drive to take something like a week, and you're going really slowly and you're meeting people the whole way and you're seeing the country warts and all. I mean, you're having these wonderful encounters with people, so hospitable. And then you meet people who are just jerks, I mean, just like it'll be anywhere else. So there was an element for me where there was sort of the sublime experience of spending the night out on Mount Carmel and cooking a stew on our little alcohol stove and looking out at the view of the Jezreel Valley, the Valley of Armageddon, right? These iconic places. And it's this beautiful experience with nature, and you feel like maybe you could be back in Bible times. But then on the other side of it, kind of experiencing Israel as a modern place in many ways, like just any other normal country. And it all comes back down to earth. So yeah, I think it affected my faith in certain ways by reminding me that, I don't know, when we venerate sites, we often find ourselves having to go back to the story behind the site, because the physical space isn't always going to be what you imagined. It may not always be the thing that brings you into contact with the divine. It might actually do the opposite.
I recall being in Israel. I've only been to Israel once, but being there was very different in taking in the sights. And so the sensory experience is very different than seeing this place that I had heard about my entire life through just images. And it was quite disorienting after being there, I think, for many of the reasons that you're describing. The glossy images, or just sort of the vibrant images, give way to something that is much more layered and complex and difficult to wrap one's head around, sort of all of the parts of it in any way, I think, at least for me, that made, I did not have an overarching narrative to take in the experience and then kind of integrate it into something that made sense. So I can definitely see how even, and I was not walking through the landscape, but even more so, I think, to your point, being able to just be on the ground and walk through those spaces very slowly, I think is a very unique experience, and I can imagine would have been really challenging to a lot of ideas that you've had about the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, one thing that comes to mind for me is that I think, and I think that there's a degree to which, an American Christian who's not super familiar with all the politics and hasn't gotten into the weeds yet, right? In 2006, I was 26 years old. I was working an office job in Oklahoma City area. And it wasn't like, I wasn't an academic at that point. I'd been to Israel several times. I was familiar with kind of the Middle East conflict and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's easy for an American in this case to kind of conflate the government of Israel and its policies and all those kinds of things with somehow the things that you read about in the Bible. There's almost kind of like, I don't know, Zionism did this as a political movement, but kind of bridging the gap between the ancient and the modern, and looking at the modern situation somehow as a fulfillment, maybe of whether it's biblical prophecy or you're just kind of linking it to the tropes that come from the Bible. But a little bit of that became highly problematized for me at that time, because I'm meeting Jews and Arabs, I'm meeting Israelis and Palestinians, and I'm seeing foreign workers who've been hired to work in these kibbutzim and moshavim, these farms and so on. And I just realized, the complexity of this kind of shatters every category of how I think of this place sort of as holy land, right? It doesn't stay in that framework once you have that deep on the ground engagement. And you start to have criticisms, you start to have opinions, you start to think, from the personal to the national. You don't like the way this trail is built. You don't like the way this person interacted with you. You don't like the rules of the national park. You don't like the occupation. There's a whole range of things that might pop up that you end up having grievances with, that, your starry-eyed view didn't take into account when you started.
Yes, and yes. Before we get into talking about your book, which I'm really looking forward to, I heard you earlier talk about while you were walking on the trail, the Israelis you were encountering are seeing these trails and the activity of hiking as a uniquely Israeli activity in an Israeli context. And I'm wondering if you can illuminate that a bit before we then dig into your book, to help us understand what it is about the Israeli psyche that sees hiking as so integral to national identity and maybe personal and or spiritual experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the stuff that I teach at Binghamton University is the history of Israel, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so on. So I really spend a lot of time in the early 20th century as a researcher and as a scholar and as a teacher. And that's where I go when I try to understand Israel's culture of hiking. And this does get into the book a little bit, but I guess I could begin by way of maybe an anecdote that made me realize what this relationship between Israelis and that country, the land, looked like. When I was preparing to go on my long walk in 2006, I couldn't find a guidebook in English. There were no English language maps, no English language guidebooks, very few online resources at that time in English. I had been studying Hebrew for a while, and I was able to kind of slog my way through a Hebrew text. So I ordered the guidebook, the kind of standard guidebook for the Israel National Trail at the time, from the Israeli publisher, and I had it mailed to my address in Oklahoma. And I actually got an email from the editor of the guidebook series asking me, did you really order this to an address in Oklahoma? We don't really send these to the States. Is this a mistake? And so I wrote back and said, no, I would really like to do it. If I need to pay extra shipping, I will. And I did, in fact. They hadn't accounted for people ordering these books in the US. And the editor said, apologized for the confusion, and then said, not many people want to come hike our little country. So it was as if no one had thought of writing the guidebooks in English, because this was never meant to be for tourist consumption. This network of trails, this act of walking the land, was seen by Zionists pre-statehood as something that was a fundamentally Jewish act. It was a thing that Jews do in order to connect with the Jewish homeland. Of course, they knew that other people physically walked, right? The country was mainly populated by Arabs in the early 20th century, and of course, they're walking all the time. But they saw what they were doing, the kind of Jewish Zionists who were settling in Palestine in the late Ottoman period, British Mandate period. They saw their intentional walks as ways of connecting their whole selves, mind, body, spirit, however you want to think about it, to the land. And there is an almost mystical idea of connectedness that is difficult to explain. The radical degree to which these early Zionists come from Europe for the most part, arrive in Palestine and see themselves as somehow being transformed, reborn in the country, maybe being fully alive for the first time, that's the way they thought about it. And as they walked, they were articulating that intentional living through the act of connectedness to the soil and the water and the plants and the air and the sunshine of the land they knew as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel.
So, wow, there's a lot to unpack here. I feel like a student in your class. So the landscape, the natural elements, the human then that is integrating into these, the walking then sort of is this ritual or a rite of passage in some way that connects the human to the land. And for many people, you said they feel reborn or they are born for the first time through this process of moving through the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
there's so much here. I'm thinking actually about the day that I went to Masada and seeing young people who were part of the Israeli Defense Force going on their own pilgrimage and climbing up. And then I ended up seeing them at the top. And this was actually when I just first started studying pilgrimages and was able to immediately identify what they were doing as a pilgrimage, and then later learned more about why they were there. So this process of walking through the landscape is happening just as an individual going out on a hike, but then there are many layers to this where the walking is also used to reinforce national identity and military identity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is a big part of the story of the construction of the state of Israel. Walking was a big part of it. So, I mean, I don't know how familiar your listeners are, but the way I try to sum it up for my students is that, Zionism as a political movement, the whole idea is to build some kind of Jewish political entity in the historic Jewish homeland. That was how they constructed it. Most of the Zionists are coming from Europe, where they identify themselves as a landless, stateless people whose relationship with the earth has sort of been cut off for the better part of 2,000 years as they've lived in host countries. And in Europe in the modern period, right? I mean, Jewish people in different countries are experiencing, they don't have equal civil rights. They can't own land. They can't move around freely. Often they're living in ghettos. So their ability to move, the trades they're able to engage in are limited by their governing authorities. And of course, it's an uneven process. They're granted rights here, they're denied rights there. And by the time you arrive at the early 20th century, growing numbers of Jews in Europe were concluding that statehood was going to be a solution to many problems for the Jewish people. So that's kind of, there's this national component of going back to the land and what that means. But it plays out on an individual level for the immigrants who come. And they basically see themselves as individuals. I've been cut off from a relationship with land and earth and soil. I'm coming from, say, the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, right? Poland, Ukraine, those kinds of places today. And I'm seeing the Russians around me farming, growing crops. In 19th century nationalism, the idealized image of the Russian peasant, right, is out there wearing the white blouse and digging in the field. And that's kind of an idealized national image. This is what it means to be a citizen of the state. And 19th century nationalisms are all doing that, right? They're all kind of trying to define this connection between the ideal member of the nation and national territory. It's this kind of blood and soil connection in Eastern Europe. So Zionists grab onto a lot of those ideas. They go to Palestine and they do the same thing. And if you're going to be a good socialist Zionist, you pick up your shovel and you go out to the field, and men and women are kind of doing egalitarian work. The women are wearing shorts and the men are wearing shorts, and they're all carrying their tools and digging and all this stuff and getting suntanned. And right? Their bodies are transforming. So they're trying to cast themselves, they're trying to be reborn in a way that's very contradictory to their own stereotypes of what Jewish life in the diaspora in Europe looks like. So they're rejecting religion, they're rejecting kind of traditional Jewish culture, and they're trying to reforge Jewish culture in a new light, to be reborn in this kind of land of Israel environment. Places like Masada, which you mentioned, so for listeners less familiar, this is an ancient mountaintop fortress east of Jerusalem in the desert overlooking the Dead Sea. It's a remote site, difficult to access. It was built in the 1st century CE by King Herod, who wants to have a place of refuge in case his people ever revolt against him. And this is in Roman-occupied Judea. Well, it gets taken over by Jewish rebels as the Romans are kind of clamping down on the country. They destroy the Jewish temple, and you have these rebel holdouts living up on the mountain. There's this legendary story told by the historian Josephus in the 1st century about how they commit suicide rather than surrender to Rome. So that story actually gets lost to history for centuries. And then in modern times, it's kind of recomposed as a Zionist story of, stubbornness, I guess, unwillingness to live under the occupation of anyone else, and preferring death to being ruled by an outside party. The Masada story became iconic for many of these Jewish hikers who are going out in the early 20th century. They're intent on becoming connected with the land, and going out to Masada was very much a civil religious pilgrimage. It's using the ideas of religious pilgrimage in service of this national idea. So they would go out there and they would say things like, Masada will never fall again. They want to go and kind of reoccupy that site and to give it a modern meaning. And they begin, after Israeli statehood in 1948, it becomes a site where elite military units go. They climb the mountain at sunrise. They climb the very path that Josephus mentions the ancient Jewish holdouts as using. It's called the Snake Path. They climb it at sunrise as dawn breaks over the mountains to the east, over the Dead Sea. And they arrive at the summit of the mountain with their flags and their uniforms and their packs, and they are inducted into the unit. Sometimes these ceremonies happened with fiery letters spelling out national slogans. So it was used as very much like kind of a stirring site to kind of gin up that patriotic fervor. So there are all kinds of stories about hikers going to Masada. So it's a fascinating place for a lot of reasons.
I think it encapsulates so many elements of pilgrimage and related rites of passage, and the exact points you're talking about regarding people integrating into the land and then also taking the land into themselves. I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship between the human who is engaging with the landscape, and then the landscape is then changed and evolves based on the humans that are passing through it. I'd like to hear more about your book, Walking the Land, A History of Israeli Hiking Trails. You start the book looking at, I mean, really the history of hiking trails is the history of the modern state of Israel. So it can't really be teased apart. And you start your exploration in 1904, looking at the beginning of Jewish hiking culture, which we've talked a little bit about, but I want to hear more about. And then you progress through the first marked trail, the Israeli hiking trails, the trail network, and then land at the national trail. So we've got a few places to go here. And since I'm sitting with the author, I'll let you walk us through walking the land, how you would like to portray that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of encapsulate the whole story, but, one thing builds on the next. So we've already talked a little bit about some of those initial dynamics, these Jewish immigrants coming from Europe and sort of reacting to anti-Semitism, reacting to their inability to have a state when they're watching national movements rise up around them. And, sometimes those national movements present themselves as very threatening. So they want to escape from that and go build their own thing in what they know as the land of Israel, what most of the world at that time knew as Palestine. In 1904, it's still the Ottoman Empire. It's still in control. World War I hasn't yet happened. And so, things are a little bit looser. The vast majority of the population, more than 90%, are Arabs, who we would call Palestinians today. So Jewish immigrants are a small minority. They're buying land, they're building little towns and farms, and they're linking them up with roads. There were essentially no paved roads in Ottoman Palestine at that time. And so they're walking from place to place, or they're riding on horseback, and they're trying to connect their settlements with lines of movement and communication. Now, at the same time, they're also trying to decide, how do we educate our youth? Babies are going to be born in this country. They'll be natives to the land. And how do we teach them? Well, with limited resources, and trying to resurrect a national language, Hebrew, they're asking the question, how do we teach children about these places and how do we teach them to be residents of this country in a kind of a native way? And the answer was walking. Walking was cheap. It was something you could integrate into the national school curriculum, which is exactly what they did. And so Jewish kids growing up in late Ottoman Palestine are being required to go and walk. They're spending time outdoors. And, that continues to be the case. Around that time, 1904, a new wave of Jewish immigrants starts coming in from Eastern Europe, the Russian Pale of Settlement. Some of those were revolutionaries who participate in the failed revolution in Russia in 1905. Some of them are on the run from the law when they go to Palestine. So they're arriving with nationalist and revolutionary fervor. Many of them are socialists, and they see their role in the Zionist nation building project to kind of pull it toward the international socialist movement. And they want self-sufficiency and independence on a level that their forebears weren't quite as dedicated to. So now you have this new crop of mostly young people. Many are coming in their late teens and early 20s, and they're building institutions that we know today as the kibbutz, for example, these kind of socialist, communist, Zionist settlements. And in order to be self-sustaining, they're devoting themselves to working the land. They see labor upon the land as the thing that's going to make you again, that same idea of being reborn. One of those socialist Jewish immigrants is David Ben-Gurion, who becomes Israel's first prime minister in 1948. And as a young man, when he arrives in Palestine, he kind of swears off his diaspora Jewish identity. He had been born David Grun, like David Green in Poland. And when he lands in Palestine, he starts calling himself Ben Gurion. He kind of Hebraicizes his name, sort of makes it a biblical kind of name. And, you can go to his tombstone today down in the Negev desert in southern Israel, and there are not 2 dates, birth and death, but there are 3 dates on the stone. There's the date of his actual physical birth. There's the date of his death. And there's also the date that he first arrived in the land of Israel. So why would you inscribe that date on your tombstone? Because it's the date that you came alive in a whole other way, right? You changed your name, you swore off these diaspora languages, and you began speaking Hebrew, and you developed a relationship with the land. For them, it wasn't just about changing one's name. It was about becoming united with the land. And they had a whole way of speaking about their relationship with the land that was very eroticized. A lot of scholars have taken note of this. This is not me pointing it out. Any historian who grapples with the early history of the Zionist movement has to figure out what they think of this strange literature in which they're describing walking across the country, and the upturned soil of a plowed field is likened to the breasts of a woman. And it's just kind of these romantic odes to the land, written as though it's a lover writing to his beloved. In fact, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, there's the famous line, "I am my beloved's and he is mine." And they will apply that. They're saying that's what the land says to us, right? The hiker or the pioneer who's laboring on the soil is always in the male role. The land is always in the female role. And in Hebrew, it's a gendered language. So the noun for earth or land is a feminine noun. So they put themselves in this kind of masculine role, and they see themselves as transforming the land and being transformed in the process. So they even say, there's this popular phrase they would say in Hebrew, we came to the land to build it and to be built in it. So for them, planting the field, digging the well, whatever, it's this productive engagement with the land that transforms it into what it should always have been, this redeemed, beautiful, promised land kind of a thing. And it's turning the Jewish people into actors in history once again. They're physically engaged, they're politically engaged, and they're rising up on their own to kind of have self-determination in the early 20th century. So there's the political and the personal really intersect there, and land is kind of the locus for actualizing all of this. So for them, hiking is much more than hiking, walking is much more than walking, and the paths, the unpaved paths of Palestine at the time are artifacts of a romanticized Jewish past. You walk these places, when you walk the path, you're walking kind of the virgin land. You're walking maybe the same routes, the same paths that Abraham walked. When God says to him, the very first words to Abraham in the book of Genesis are, Lech lecha, go and walk. And so they're looking at biblical texts, even if they're not religiously observant, almost as a historical document proving that Jews have always been walking this land. And when we walk this land, we are connecting with the ancient past. We're being who we were always meant to be. So that's the foundation of this whole story. And when I tell the story of how those hiking trails kind of begin to grow across the country, it's complicated. They don't start marking trails as their own, like dedicating them as hiking routes, until the very cusp of Israeli independence. The United Nations in November 1947 is going to meet and decide, do we partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state? Super contentious decision, right? If the vote is yes, then there will be a Jewish state. If the vote is no, then Jews and Arabs are going to have to work this out on their own, and who knows what's going to happen. Well, 1 week before that vote, there had been a map released by the United Nations showing Jewish territory and Arab territory. Well, a detachment of Jewish paramilitary kind of special forces scouts, they had all grown up in the hiking movements, the hiking clubs of pre-statehood Palestine. They were all elite hikers who had walked the country length and breadth. And it's from their ranks that the special forces units of what's going to become the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, are drawn. And it's them going out on the morning of November 22nd, 1947, inside Arab designated territory under the UN partition plan. They go out to this, what's supposed to become part of an Arab state, and they begin painting red and white blazes on the rocks, climbing up an isolated headland over the Dead Sea that constitutes kind of the most difficult obstacle on the path to Masada. So they were basically making a declaration. They were painting something onto the land. These are literal marks of ownership, even as they're designed to lead hikers safely up a dangerous terrain obstacle, right? These cliffs that overhang the Dead Sea. They're painting the marks high enough on the rocks. They actually bring step ladders as they climb the mountain so they can climb up and paint the blazes real high so that Bedouin Arabs who, move all throughout that area with their herds and flocks won't erase them. So they know what they're doing. They know that this is a claim on territory and that walking is one claim. To walk a path says that you have a right to be here. But to paint a blaze is to transform the land kind of in the way that they had been thinking of redeeming it and transforming themselves. They're having this tactile relationship now with the trail, painting onto the rock, making it theirs. And then even when they're gone, that sign, that symbol declares that this is a route for hiking, but specifically for Jewish hikers to walk to this civil religious pilgrimage site. So that's sort of where the DNA of Israel's hiking trail system can be traced, right? It goes back to this one trail. And as it happens, Israel and its Arab neighbors and the Palestinians, they all go to war. in late 1947, early 1948, into 49. And in the process, Jordan takes over the area where that first trail was blazed. So Israeli hikers after statehood have to look elsewhere. That's what I was showing you in this map. They blaze trails right up to the green line that demarcates the West Bank. And when Israel conquers the West Bank from the Jordanians in 1967, some of the very first people, civilians, to go in, right on the heels of the military, within days of the Israeli conquest of that territory, hikers are in there with their paintbrushes and their paint. They find the original trail from 1947. They photograph its blazes and document, hey, we've returned. We can once again climb this headland on route to Masada. And they begin marking the rest of the territory as well. Israeli trail networks spread rapidly across that part of the West Bank. And throughout the 60s, they end up expanding just to kind of cover the whole country. So the book is the story of the growth of that network, and it moves away from kind of nativism and nationalism to more pragmatic everyday things, I guess, later on. All of the disputes that Israelis have about use of land, ownership of land, public rights, rights of way, seashore access, kind of the nuts and bolts of what it is to have a functioning modern country. Hiking trails are part of that story. Because people attached such meaning to trails in the early days, it was existential on a personal level and on a national level. They'll apply, that kind of intense language to other things. If you're an environmental activist, marking a trail can be a declaration that no one's ever going to be able to build a factory here. We've marked this trail because this is part of the nature of the land of Israel. So the meaning of hiking, the meaning of marking these trails evolves over time. But none of the meanings that get layered on ever completely disappear.
Wow.
I know, sorry, really long answer to your question.
Really, yeah, very informative answer. And it's given me a lot to think about in terms of what trails in this sense are far more than pieces of earth that people walk through or walk on. And you've touched a lot on the socio-political motivations for placing marks on certain landscapes. And I was wondering about what does that mean in terms of how the state protects these particular places? Is the trail marking, does that precede there's some type of kind of formalized protection or conservation action, or is it just like a free-for-all? Anyone can go out and mark a site and then it gets adopted into a trail network?
That's a really insightful question, because in Israel, as with everything, it's kind of complicated to answer. So this trail system gets marked. I mean, so like this original map, I mean, it looks kind of homemade, right? So the people who made this map, there's that 1947 trail. It's not until the early 60s that Israelis kind of get back around to seriously marking trails. And when they do, they sort of do it with a vengeance. I mean, the trails grow really fast. Hikers finally are wanting marked, designated routes that can keep people safe in these dangerous areas. But the people who mark this, I mean, the reason it looks kind of homemade is because it sort of is. Kibbutz En Gedi, a small little town on the shores of the Dead Sea, has this field school where kids are coming from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and they're being taught environmental education out there. It's kind of a grassrootsy way of doing it. It becomes institutionalized eventually. The Ministry of Education in Israel says, we should get on board with this. And they start sending schools to go and study there and at other field schools. So the state is helping support these schools, which then go out and mark trails. But the state never comes up with rules for who can mark trails where. And later in the 60s, there's finally a law denoting nature reserves and national parks. And in that law, it says hikers can go visit these areas, but they have to stay on marked trails. But the government never bothered defining who could mark a trail. And so it became this de facto nature preservation organization. It's called the Society for Protection of Nature in Israel. They managed these field schools, and they became the custodians of the trail network. And even though it wasn't codified in law that they were the custodians, they tended to erase any trails they found that were theirs. So they did that ostensibly on safety grounds, because they're also marking them on the ground, and they're marking them on maps. And those things have to be unified if you want the trail system to make sense. And right, you have to be able to find where you are on the map if you're in the desert, and you don't want to get a confusing trailblaze that leads you the wrong way. So they would erase these places and only keep theirs. So that's the way they're approaching it. But yeah, as Israel being a small country, most people compare it to like New Jersey or Massachusetts in the United States, small land area, as that Zionist ethos that we talked about. Let's build the land and let's be built in it. Well, through the 40s, through the 50s, they're just going like gung-ho on that. And they're building factories and urbanizing the country. And suddenly people start to realize, if we keep doing that, if we keep trying to actualize Zionist identity by transforming the land, there's not going to be anything left to enjoy. It's just going to be a paved wasteland. So when the pendulum swings back, there too, hiking trails become super important as tools for preserving land. So they begin to transcend just routes for enjoying nature. Once a trail gets marked on the ground, it's a line in the sand. It's you've sort of said this is dedicated for hikers, and you can now mobilize hikers to be moving and stay present in these areas. And you better bet, if there's going to be like a quarry zoned for a beautiful Galilee mountainside, or antennas built down in the Negev desert for radio stations, hikers using those trails are going to start mobilizing, and they'll push back. And so the social activism that's born in that left-wing Israeli, that kind of radical revolutionary Zionist culture pre-state, you could still see it out on the trails in the 60s and the 70s, 80s even, as people start to use these trails as lines of protest to kind of say, no, this belongs to the people, this belongs to nature, and we're going to keep it that way. So they become little battlegrounds in the internal Israeli conversations about nature and environment.
I can definitely see where this could happen and where it could get quite contentious on so many levels. And I was wondering, when you were talking about just the concept of trails, are we talking about any pathway that connects 2 points, or is this entirely in kind of a natural landscape? Are there roads, paved roads, that are part of these trails also, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, today it's a combination. I mean, originally, so in the US, if you visit a national park or a state park, often the trails you walk are built trails. They're trails that someone said, well, we should go make a trail around the lake or something. Maybe there was an existing deer trail, but they improved a lot of it. And we've walked these kinds of trails that are mulched or maybe partially paved, or there's handrails or steps or whatever, bridges. In Israel, if you go to the desert areas where these hikers were first really getting into it, down around Masada, some of these trails are extremely old, and people have had a very long time to improve them. In fact, some of the trails coming up from the Dead Sea are themselves archaeological relics. That, they're zigzagging switchbacks and they're retaining walls. Archaeologists will go and actually study the trail infrastructure and say, well, this goes back to the Israelite or the Canaanite period. So all they had to do was walk the trails that were already there. Later, when they mark them, there's very little actual trail work being done. They're just painting blazes and surveying them on maps. So they're not really building these, and they're venerating the unpaved paths. I mean, this is where it's at. If you want contact with the soil and the land of Israel, the unpaved path offers that kind of direct, unmediated experience with the ground. Later on, though, people start to want trail systems where they can hike right out of their suburb with their families. They want family-friendly paths. They don't they're not out there to put on khaki and go conquer the frontier areas. And, this is not what it's all about. In the 80s, if you live in Haifa, you want a trail system built out in the hills of Mount Carmel where you can go hike with your kids. So yeah, at that point, trails are starting to get blazed along sidewalks and roads, and some trails are being built. And it starts to shift toward maybe a more North American and European way of making trails and walking trails. So today it unfolds all kinds. But the Israeli trail system, I would say to anybody who's interested in looking at trail networks or trail systems generally, you can do comparative studies of national trail networks. And Israel's is not entirely unique, but compared to US and Europe, a lot of these trails are really old. Just one very short anecdote. I was once hiking around Masada with some friends when I lived in Jerusalem. And we were down at the foot of the mountain walking near the Dead Sea. And we were walking on what was marked on the map as a 4x4 road. So it's like a 2-track kind of, it looks like a gravel road, otherwise surrounded by gravel. But there are rocks kind of spaced like along each side of the road, kind of outlining where the route goes. And I made a comment to my friend who happened to be an archaeologist. Sure was nice that someone kind of moved these rocks and made it a neat little roadway, and we can walk without any trail markings, really. And he said, this wasn't made by modern trail people. And I was like, well, who did it then? And he said, the Roman 10th Legion did that 2,000 years ago. They moved the rocks. And I was like, come on, man. He's like, who puts the rocks back in the desert? It's 100 degrees. You're not, covering this all back up. The Roman 10th Legion would pull wagons with 2 horses next to each other. And that's the same width as a Jeep today, basically. And so what looks to us like a 4x4 road is in fact a military road built by the Roman 10th Legion when they were going to lay siege to Masada and the Jewish rebels in the 1st century CE. So I would say that kind of thing to me always makes Israel's trail network interesting, even if we're tempted to look at it as just a modern trail network now where hikers are going out and putting on their packs and boots and everything else. There's still this underlying character of, something much older.
Yeah, that's wild to think about, that what you're looking at is the result of a Roman military unit 2,000 years ago moving stones. So you have expanded your interest in trails beyond Israel to kind of a wider focus on trails. You're involved in a really interesting initiative called the trailology net. Is it the network or collective?
We're calling it collective. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I couldn't remember if it was network or collective. You've introduced some new terms to me. Well, trailology, did I say that right? Is the first term. Trailologist is a second term. You're doing really interesting work in sort of this multidisciplinary, post-disciplinary way, bringing together both scholars and practitioners to work together to look at how people use trails and what trails are and what they mean and how they connect society. And I've got to ask the question, I've got to pin you down on a working definition of what is a trail.
Well, that's the problem, right? I think when you try to, that was one of the first things that made me think there needed to be a bigger conversation about trails and how the trailology idea, bit of a tongue twister, was born. So what is a trail? I mean, you were just asking the question in Israel's trail system, is it composed of just footpaths or is it also roads? And you can expand that out even bigger to say, well, I mean, what about an equine trail where people ride horses? That's a trail, right? Yeah, I guess so. So we might say, well, maybe fundamentally a trail is damage to the earth along a line of movement. Animals make trails, humans make trails. But do we expand that out? Does it all have to be damage, like a line through vegetation or on desert soil, hard-packed soil made by the feet of something? What about vehicle trails? What about a motorcycle trail? Is it a trail or does it start becoming something else? Do we call that a road and say it's no longer a trail? Um, no one I've talked to it is willing to give a hard and fast definition to trail because, I mean, what about people who take canoes through all the connected lakes of the Adirondacks in upstate New York? I mean, there's a canoe route, and sometimes you have to carry your canoe over land to get, but from one lake to the next. That part looks like a trail where you're walking, but what about when you're in the water? Is that a trail? Is it a canoe trail? Even if there's no visible, right? It vanishes as soon as you've paddled past it. Um, I would say, yeah, that's a kind of trail. So do we define it based on how it looks or how it was made or usage? And where do we draw those lines? I would say that I don't have a great answer to this, but I do want to think bigger about what trails are. If you if you go to if you go to a national park or you talk to the U.S. Forest Service, they might have working definitions of what trails are. And in the literature about trails and how they're used and whatever, I mean, the economics of trails, most people are thinking about recreational trails. But those are really walking as a form of recreation is kind of a 19th century invention. So it hasn't been around for very long. And humans have been making trails. It's probably maybe the most fundamental thing humans do. I mean, before the first person built the first building, the first person probably made a trail. I mean, without thinking, it's something that we do. Spiders spin webs and humans make trails. Other animals do too. Some of the earliest we have, you can go back. There's a great book by Robert Moore called On Trails. And he begins by talking about very early in the fossil record, we can find trails made by some of the first moving organisms that we can find evidence of. And so, and these kind of things moving around in the water that we can't even identify. We have evidence of their trails. So, or paths. What do we want to call these things? So I think that I want to think beyond recreational trails, certainly. I think it's worth thinking beyond human trails, and it may be worth thinking beyond visible trails. I wonder if someday when the first people go to Mars, will people recall or map the flight path of the ship it took? And will we someday, when we become an interplanetary species, if that happens, will we talk about the trails that people took across the solar system or across the stars? I don't know. But I think that some of this is semantic. Trail, path, road, route, way, journey. There are any number of things that come into our language, and we often use them metaphorically. I think we can definitely say that movement and the making of lines through movement related to our movement seems to be something very intrinsic about what we think about what it is to be human. And as such, trails pretty much penetrate into every dimension of human life and animal life and the world today as we know it. You can find trails everywhere if you look.
I'm even thinking about neurological pathways in the brain where neurons travel and then future neurons come down the same pathways, and that's how certain behavioral patterns emerge or thought patterns is through the repeated traveling of neurons through pathways. It also
Absolutely.
seems that there's something related to the return of that activity. So I'm thinking of if a human or an animal walks through a field and then another human or animal goes a different way, that's not really a path or a trail. But as soon as the next being traces over top of a place where another being has been, that starts a trail system, that starts a pathway. And that's super interesting.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think there are, and so we're starting to get into how already in this conversation, one can imagine how many different scholarly disciplines have a stake in this question of what trails are and what they do and what are their effects and how do people live in the world. I mean, so there are, physiologists, behavioral psychologists who will look at that question of trail formation. How much, and are human trails formed the same way ant trails are formed, or cattle trails, or elephant trails, or deer trails, or whatever? No. different types of trails emerge from the unique physiologies and psychologies of different creatures. So when I talk about trailology as a broad way of studying trails, part of the reason that me and some of my colleagues chose that term is because we couldn't use the word pathology, because pathology has its own definition and it has to do with kind of the ways of thinking, those internal trails in our brains. I actually don't know if pathology is related to the word for a physical path, but I would suspect that there is some connection etymologically. So yeah, we can just, even the question of trail formation, we can bring multiple disciplines into that conversation and say, well, what do you have to say about the way a trail forms?
To the pathology, I'm thinking of pathology as that which deviates from the norm, which is an indicator that there must be a path to begin with, that some type of behavior veers off of that, and then it's considered pathological. So that's a whole other topic, I guess, to explore at some point. And this concept of different layers of meaning is also fascinating as it pertains to trails, because people, depending on what we bring internally and the meaning or meanings that we bring to a landscape or a path, inside our psyche, depends on where we then move through that particular trail system or landscape. And if I'm bringing a particular meaning in terms of the human-built environment or wells, I'm thinking of pilgrimages now and sort of the overlap here. I'm going to go to certain sites or connect to sites very differently than someone else who brings a different set of meaning and a different kind of narrative to the same space. And I would imagine that you bump into this quite a bit in your work, especially in Israel, but probably in other ways within the trail paradigm.
Yeah, no, that's true, because I mean, if you think about, I mean, so I think, yeah, when you speak about pilgrimage routes, you're reaching for the destinations or the nodes in a network that are going to be important for the pilgrim traveler. A person traveling with a spiritual goal in mind may or may not impose certain spiritual values onto the journey itself. So, but I would even say those values can be historicized. They're informed by different things. I mean, for example, we think about the Camino de Santiago in Spain. There's a big conversation around that, right? Is it a hiking trail? Is it a biking route? Is it a pilgrimage walk? Is it all three? Is it more than that? And sure, you need to get water. You need to get food. There are limits to what the average hiker is going to be able to do in terms of a day's exertion or the steepness of the climb and so on. So you're operating within certain baselines. But if you're a spiritual pilgrim today, you might associate a mountaintop or a ridge line with the sublime experience that you associate with the divine. But if you went back a few hundred years, mountains were not attractive sites for walkers. I mean, really, a few hundred years. Okay, the 1700s in Europe, you're starting to get a mountaineering culture where people are starting to get interested in climbing up the Alps and going to Mont Blanc and the Matterhorn and places like that. But you get much earlier than that, and mountains are the domain of spirits and demons. They're cold and dangerous. They're not places where people live, and they're obstacles to travel. They're not attractive destinations for travel. So like you say, we impose values and beliefs onto a landscape, and that helps determine where we end up walking. So are we prioritizing adventure, or are we prioritizing safety? Are we thinking of the spiritual, or are we thinking of the pragmatic? There are all kinds of gray areas in between. And I would say it's bigger than even that, right? I mean, we can probably imagine any number of values or concerns that would chart a course for people at different historical periods where maybe different priorities are front of mind as people move.
Bringing in this idea of meaning and landscape, and the idea that within ourselves, we do not contain an absolute truth, although it can feel that way. Oftentimes we think our perspective is sort of the way to see the world. I can imagine that you have been part of discussions r- with regards to the trail system in Israel, I know there are a number of initiatives to bring people together on these trails who may see the land in very different ways, who have very different ideas around nationalism and ethnicity and religion and race and what does this mean. And then these kind of very diverse groups of people are brought together on a trail and they move through that landscape together. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about how these trails lend themselves to interesting dialogues around identity.
Mm. Um, well, it's another big question. I think in the Israeli context, and it's hard to just talk about Israel because Israel controls a bigger area than what most people would say, right? In the political world, the international law world, right? Israel exists within certain boundaries, but it also controls the West Bank, and today it's controlling the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, and so there are different territories that Israel controls that aren't part of what's strictly Israel proper for most people. But that itself is wrangled over, right? You have Palestinians who will say, well, there is no Israel proper. This was a modern political movement that ended up taking land from the Arabs and so on. And so it's all Palestine. It's a denial of that claim. On the other side, you have Israeli right-wingers who say there's no West Bank and Gaza Strip. It's all the historic land of Israel. So territorial claims themselves will underscore where people think they have the right to walk. And so on, right? And who they should walk with and who should be allowed to walk where. So in Israel, that's very overt. You have lines on the map. You have identifiable lines, a line between the West Bank and Israel proper. And whether you choose to take a trail as a Jewish Israeli that crosses that line, it's not just a recreational decision. It's a political decision. And there, that just seems so overt. But I think it's true almost everywhere. Our culture of hiking in the United States has a history. The idea of hiking at all, period, has a history. And we can go back to the European hikers who built that culture of hiking there, and we can go back to the people in America who were kind of defining what our culture of walking would look like, known as hiking now. And politics are part of it. Manifest destiny is part of it. Religious, spiritual, political ideas are all bound up with how we walk now. We walk the way we walk because we were taught to walk that way. And there are images, the gear we carry and the way we dress and standing on the summit. There's a whole iconography to our walks and the way we document them, the way we Instagram them or whatever. There are all these lines of descent. In Israel-Palestine, I'll use that term to say, well, I mean, it was Palestine in the modern period. Like, I don't mean to be political with that term necessarily. It's more to acknowledge we have one geography that is known as Israel or Palestine. And there are parts that are more Palestine-y and parts that are more Israeli. And, so when I think about that larger unit, the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that contested territory, yes. The journeys people take are in that. I mean, they're very much bound up with that contested landscape. And there are some initiatives. I would say they're not the norm. And they're kind of minority things where people think, okay, these would be good places for people to walk together. Because one other dimension of walking is that you can go back to the peripatetic philosophers of Greece who would argue that walking is a way to solve one's problems. It's a way to think things through. There's some kind of, again, physiological and psychological connection that gives rise to people having ideas while they walk or being able to think through problems. I teach some of my students, right, the phrase ascribed, I think, to Diogenes the Cynic, Greek philosopher, solvitur ambulando, as it gets articulated in Latin, I think by way of St. Augustine. It will be solved by walking, right? You'll solve this problem that way. So there are some people who think that these larger struggles over territory that manifest themselves in the form of war, even like we see now, that walking could be part of the solution. I used to work for an organization called the Abraham Path Initiative when I lived in Jerusalem. I taught at the Hebrew University on the kind of in the world of kind of Israeli culture and life. And then I worked as a consultant for a Palestinian NGO that was working to build a walking route across the West Bank. And moving between those worlds was really interesting. and seeing where those worlds sometimes overlap was also interesting. Now, the path that I used to work for was not a peace project. It wasn't designed for Israelis to come and hike. It was more Palestinians who experienced a lot of limits on their movement because of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. They needed a way to connect their communities. And this was a tourism project, but also a movement project, had a lot of really interesting components to it. And by and large, I think there was a sense that this will be good for people. It will be good for society, for Palestinian society to be able to walk. It will give an outlet for people whose lives have really been ground down by conflict, to have, an outlet, but also to bring in tourism, economy. I mean, there were all these upsides to it. But in some ways, people who are trying to do those kinds of things, trying to build trails for the sake of larger society, for a more stable world, sometimes in that part of the world, their voices in the wilderness, the nationalists often are yelling louder. And so the folks who will say, no, it's our right to walk here and not their right to walk here, often they're the ones who get heard and are willing to impose conditions on the ground that prevent others from walking. So I have hope in the large sense that walking is good for people, and it's good for societies, and it's good for people in conflict to connect and to resolve some of their disputes. But I'm also conscious of the fact that walking can be a powerful tool in the other direction. You can use it to mobilize one group and exclude another. A trail can be a line of movement for one group of people and a boundary or a border or an obstacle for others who fear to cross it, lest the people traveling it use violence. So I don't mean to be super pessimistic or glass half empty. I do have hopes, but yeah.
I think probably the idea that people can walk together and solve problems may be a little bit oversimplistic. It's much more complex, and I also am aware of a number of initiatives that are aiming to do this, and I suppose the results are yet to be seen. I mean, this is very long-term, multi-generational work, and not something that is necessarily solved because a group of people go out for 3 days on a walk. That would be wonderful. We could solve a lot of problems if that was the case. We may be able to contribute to global peace if it was simple as taking a walk with other people for a few days.
Well, I mean, I would say that, like, to kind of add some optimism back to it. Yeah, I don't think walking by itself will solve these huge problems, but it can contribute to the solutions to these problems. So in my trailology world, looking at trails in bigger context and going beyond just recreational trails, I work with some people in what's called the European Ramblers Association. They're changing their name, but it's kind of the main big hiking association in Europe. And in the 1970s, some of their leaders were involved in building what were called e-paths that were designed to cross the entire European continent at a time when the Soviet Union was still, kind of dominating the eastern half, the eastern side, and the Iron Curtain was there and so on. But they were, before the fall of the Soviet Union, blazing and planning trails, mapping trails that would lead right up to the boundary between Eastern and Western Europe. And then hikers inside the Soviet Union were making their paths aimed to connect them and intersect them. And they're doing this in 1975. I mean, a decade and a half before the political realities, the realities on the ground really start to change. And I said to some of these folks, but this was really revolutionary. It was really radical what you were doing. And they were saying, no, we just wanted to walk. We wanted to just envision being able to walk. And I'm trying to say, no, that is political. That's a huge grassrootsy way to approach a huge geopolitical conflict. And then, they say kind of grudgingly, well, okay, I guess it was kind of utopian. But I think being able to envision those kinds of things through walking contributes to a larger whole, right? Mobilization of society on a grassroots level can really benefit from something as pragmatic as walking. I mean, you can go to the boundary between Poland and the Czech Republic, and there's a Czech-Polish friendship trail where the leaders of those two countries, as communism was beginning to wane, they were walking that border. And today, what used to be a border now in the Schengen zone is a trail that checks and poles can walk together without any border controls. So I think there's a reason why turning a border into a trail is so massively emblematic, right? Because walking is a way to begin envisioning new realities. So I'll swing the pendulum back toward optimism on that one.
Certainly gives an individual agency in a world that seems so the problems are so complex, and the idea of solving them is multifaceted, but an individual walking a trail towards another individual who's walking a trail towards, this person, that's a very powerful symbol and also reality. It's not just symbolic. They're actually putting footsteps into the landscape in a way that will eventually connect.
That's right. I mean, walking is a great metaphor that we have for action and life. I mean, when we were talking about pathologies earlier, you were saying, if pathology is a deviation from the norm, that means there's a normal way of doing things. Well, the word way refers to a road or a path. But we apply it to everything we do. I have a way of doing this and a way of doing that, but fundamentally it means a via, a road. So we can't get away from this in our language. I think when we want to turn ideas into action, walking is one of the first images we reach for. It just seems like we want to walk things out if we can.
Certainly had some really interesting ideas while walking, and I have tried this year to incorporate more outdoor walks as part of my daily routine for that exact there's so many benefits of walking. We could devote like 5 or 10 episodes to that. So I've got one last question for you. It seems like this concept of trails and trailology, it's so vast and exciting and interesting and full of potential. Where are you headed in the next 5 years? Where is your path leading, and what inspires you?
Yeah, thank you. So we've talked about trailology. I haven't really defined what it is. I as someone who, I wrote this book about Israeli hiking trails, and for me, it highlighted to me that not many people who do what I do as a historian who's paying attention to politics, they don't see trails as part of those kinds of stories. They don't think that history and politics are really very relevant in the trail conversation. And I've seen that that's true. Generally, if I go to a conference that talks about trails, almost everybody's talking about recreational trails. And that's fine. That's great. Because like you say, there are all kinds of benefits to walking trails. And I think people should be out walking. It's good for us, and it's natural. I mean, it's just a human part of human life, a thing that we do. Even those who can't physically walk, right? Being out on trails, no matter how you're accessing them, whether it's wheelchair or something like that, trails are of value, it seems. But thinking beyond recreational trails, I've tried to encourage other academics to say, look, we're not just interested in trails because of their economic benefits to communities, or because we want to limit erosion in alpine areas, right? Or manage visitors in national parks. Trails aren't just means to an end. They're things worth studying in and of themselves. And often people who study trails study it within their disciplinary silo. But because trails are everywhere, I think we suffer when you're not having an interdisciplinary conversation about them. So when the scientist says, this trail is going straight up the mountainside and it's causing all kinds of erosion, that's good. But that person should probably also be thinking about, why does the trail go that way? Why were people so interested in just going straight up to the summit? Why do people like that challenging climb? Do they want a switchbacking route that's more erosion friendly? Maybe, maybe not. But for whatever reason, we ascribed meaning to that summit. I'm thinking about places like the White Mountains, the Adirondacks, the Northeast US, where hiking culture was really oriented for a long time around summits. Probably still is. So the trails developed the way they did. So it takes a historian, it takes a sociologist, it takes somebody who's able to think about these other dimensions of how these networks take shape to give some context to why the erosion is happening in the first place. And it goes the other direction too. those who are interested in developing trails, and maybe some people will say, oh, we should make a trail that commemorates an event, or we should remember the journey of a person, right? So people will build trails sometimes with a social agenda in mind or a project in mind. But if they don't know the concerns of hikers or the concerns of people on foot in general or sustainability issues, they might design a terrible trail, and one that nobody's going to want to walk. So I've seen that in real life too. So trailology is a way to try to connect all of these things. So I've been building a group at Binghamton University where I work, but also inside a group where I've been volunteering for a long time called the World Trails Network. Great network of international trail developers, scholars, academics, practitioners of all kinds. And within my university community and in the larger World Trails Network, we're trying to build this trailology group as an ongoing conversation to be talking about trails through different disciplinary lenses and start to form a kind of a shared language about all this. So we wrote what's called the Trailology Manifesto. It's on our website, trailology.net. It's very much in its nascent stages, so don't criticize the appearance of the website too much. And it's not just me. There are other colleagues working along with me, co-leading the initiative. We're all trying to articulate what it means to be a trailologist, no matter where we come from in terms of our scholarly disciplines. So that's a big piece of what I'm trying to do. In terms of actually walking that out, my most recent project, my book project currently, involved walking around the Dead Sea. So this landscape that we talked about at the very beginning, I became interested in it when I was writing my book. But all the things we've been talking about now, for me, come together in this walk around the Dead Sea. Its history, it's sort of challenging national borders. The Dead Sea lies on the border zone between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. And so I retraced the route of a 1934 group that was, to their knowledge, the first recorded group to walk around the Dead Sea on foot all the way. It was done in a political context that we won't try to dig into right now or anything. But since 1934, no one repeated that feat. No one was ever able to duplicate that and walk around the Dead Sea all the way around. One copycat group I know of tried, and a person died en route, and they didn't do it. And then later, politically, it just became impossible. So in 2022, a friend of mine who worked with me on the Abraham Path, we joined together and we walked around the Dead Sea through Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank. And it was a kind of a way to try to do a trailological approach to a massive environmental crisis. The Dead Sea is disappearing. How has it changed between 1934 and now? What kind of challenges pop up that stymied the 1934 hikers at times? Mud flats, there were risk of arrest by British police. There were different things. But now today we're dealing with industrialization, sinkholes, a lot of modern problems, minefields, military bases, surveillance, all kinds of things that characterize those militarized border zones. Those are destroying the Dead Sea and making it hard for regular people to walk around. So that's a project that's ongoing. It's kind of experimenting with this thing. What insights do we gain when we set out to really walk through an area with an eye on its history and its politics and its archaeology and its modern, economy and all of that kind of stuff. So taking an interdisciplinary approach to the study of a route around a phenomenon in a place is really fruitful, I think. So trying to come up with methods of trailology, even as we build the Trailology Network.
Sounds very fascinating. And you are writing a book, or you've just written a book about it, or it's ongoing?
It's ongoing, yeah.
Well, the research is always more fun.
That's right.
Well, I look forward to seeing that when it is finished, and very interesting to be walking in the footsteps of people from 1934.
Yeah. Our gear was slightly different from what they carried. Yeah.
So have you finished the walk, or you're going back and doing segments of it?
No, the whole goal. So this was a group of people in British Mandate Palestine. These were Jewish hikers who they were Zionists, and they wanted to walk around the Dead Sea. It's part of this whole thing of becoming part of the land and so on. And also, I think, staking a claim that went beyond the boundaries of the strict boundaries of their national project at the time. So we weren't walking in their footsteps in that political sense. But since they did a thing that nobody had managed to repeat, we wanted to walk in their footsteps just spatially and see if we could do an unbroken circle around the sea. They spent 12 days doing it in 1934. Each man, they were all 19 years old. Each one lost at least 10 kilograms of weight. That's 22 pounds in the span of about 12 days. They saw bears in the canyons northeast of the Dead Sea. Those don't exist there anymore. Environmentally, the whole area changed. And then they held up Bedouin Arabs at gunpoint and stole their water. I mean, the stuff they did is absolutely off the rails. And so again, we didn't want to walk in the spirit of these folks, but we did want to see what it was like then and now. So we spent 14 days walking around and had to really push. I mean, we were literally pushing the boundaries. We were trying to get up to a militarized boundary, basically in a no man's land with minefields, and see how close we could get to making a complete circle in Jordan, Israel, and the West Bank. I regret to say we came a little over 8 kilometers short of walking a complete unbroken line. And the only breaks were right there in those border zones. We were actually briefly detained by Jordanian intelligence and military police. We were stopped by Israeli national parks and nature reserves personnel. So there are areas where nobody seems to want you to walk. But another intersection with pilgrimage was that the journey had to start and end for us in the Jordan River, which is part of basically the northern end of the Dead Sea. The only place where you can get in the water and basically touch the borderline that runs through the river is the traditional baptism site of Jesus. So we started at the Jordanian bank where they commemorate it. And I actually got in the water in a white baptismal robe and got under the water and came as close as I could to touching the national boundary, and then got out and started walking. And when we came back on the Israeli side, I put my baptismal robe back on and got back in the water and came as close to the border as I could. So was I a pilgrim or was I a trekker? I guess we can leave your listeners to decide until I finish the book manuscript.
I'm going to say you were a pilgrim. This is like an epic pilgrimage journey. Thank you so much for spending time talking about your book, about trails, about contested landscapes, and about the really interesting trailology collective that you are leading and moving forward. I'm really interested to see where this all goes, and I hope to plug in as I can, because obviously there's a lot of super interesting overlap between trails and pilgrimages have always traveled along trails. So the trails, I suppose, I don't know, this is maybe a chicken or egg. Which one came first, pilgrimage or trails? That we may have to explore that at a later point. Anyway, thank you so much. I will put a link up to the Trailology Collective, which you mentioned at the end of the episode, and also to your book as well.
Hey, thank you so much. This is a wonderful conversation. I'm really glad that we've gotten to have it. Thank you.